Hi, I'm Dr. Annette Feravich from Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit, and you can find us on the internet at healthymindbodyspirit.net. And I am here in my backyard in Michigan, and I am coming to bring you the second video in our series on self-esteem. So if you recall, the first video series was on cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling that we have when our attitudes don't match our behaviors. In order to bring our attitudes and our behaviors in line, we engage in what's called consonant thinking. Sometimes we stop and look at the incongruity between our attitudes and our behaviors. And then what we need to do is we need to bring those in line. And so moving along, this topic is going to be then on biases. And so what are biases? Biases are when we give favoritism to our particular thoughts or feelings or ideas. We're going to just kind of stick with that when we're talking about self-esteem. And so we bias information in ways that will help us feel better. And so it's a really good idea to look at what our natural inclinations might be to bias information. And then this way we can always kind of watch out for that a little bit. Right? As far as our self-esteem goes, there are cognitive components to the self-esteem, right? Our thoughts. And then there are also, we call them affective components, or they are our emotional components to our self-esteem. We're going to talk about those a little bit later on in another video in our series. But right now what we're going to do is we're going to spend time talking about the cognitive component to self-esteem. So there are three categories of biases that I would like to talk to you about. The first category would be experience. So we bias things based on our experiences. The second category is intuition. We bias things based on the way that we feel about things, our intuition. And the third category of biases that I want to talk about is that we bias information based on authority figures. So those are the three areas I want to talk about. Okay, so the first area of biases is biasing information based on our experiences. So a lot of times we get a lot of information from our experiences, and in fact, that's how we build our values, is based on our experiences, right? Do we have direct experiences with people who are kind to us? Do we have direct experiences with people who have treated us unfairly, right? And then that's how we get our value system. So let's say that we have an experience where we say to our friends that I can get by, for example, on 4 hours of sleep. Okay. All right. Well, generally based on our experiences, what we fail to do is we fail to look at all possible outcomes of that experience. In order to be certain about whether or not we are seeing something accurately or not, we want to make sure that we are looking at all possible outcomes. So in the example of I can get by on 4 hours of sleep, as a scientist, what I would want to do is I would need to measure individuals who have 4 hours of sleep, successful, 4 hours of sleep, unsuccessful, that means I don't feel good, right? More than 4 hours, the regular 8 hours of sleep, I feel good, successful. The regular 8 hours of sleep, I don't feel good, unsuccessful. And that's what we do as scientists to make sure that we don't bias the outcomes that we see. All right, so that is the first way that we bias, through experience. The second way that we bias is through intuition. One way that we use intuition that biases our thinking is, for example, when we hear a good story. It makes sense to us. The story makes sense. So, for example, scientifically speaking, there is a concept which is called catharsis. And the idea is this: when my emotions or anger gets all stirred up and I end up getting a lot of tension for whatever reason, that a good way to release that tension would be through physical activity. So going out on the football field or exercising or running, those are good ways to get rid of that tension. And some of those are good ways. But if we are getting rid of that tension in an aggressive way, actually that does not relieve our tension. It actually creates habits for the way that we handle our anger. mirror, for example. So the point here about biases is this. Sometimes it sounds like a good story to us, and sometimes it really makes sense to us. That story makes sense. But unless we have tested that theory actually in a systematic way, then we might be biased about the way that we see that information. A second way that we utilize our intuition in biasing is that we tend to favor available information. And very often, available information is that information that supports our own beliefs. So, studies were done where we had magazines on a table, and some of them promoted IQ tests, saying that they were very good and very credible. Another magazine saying that IQ tests were not credible. Which magazine would you pick up? What we found out is that it depended on how people felt about their own IQ. If they felt like they had low self-esteem about their IQ, they would tend to pick up magazines that suggested IQ tests were not that valid. If individuals had high IQs or were made to feel that they had higher IQs, they tended to pick up the magazine that then supported studies in IQ. And so what we do is we tend to cherry pick. Okay, and then the third way I said I was going to talk about that we bias information through authority figures. So we look at our authority figures and we determine whether or not they are good sources of information. Do you think that this is a credible source for information? And now take a look at this picture. And is this person a credible source for information? And which one do you think is a more credible source for information? Okay, and the point of this is that often we have our own biases about gender, race, age. We have our biases about looks, about clothing, about knowledge. We have all kinds of biases. And so what are you basing your information on when you hear an authority figure give you your information? So to summarize then on our topic on biases and how it relates to self-esteem, remember that sometimes we distort information in order to make ourselves feel better. It's very difficult to change behaviors. And so what we do is we engage in bias thinking in order to feel good about the inconsistencies between our attitudes and our behaviors. This is Annette Feravich from Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. Don't forget you can find us on the web at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. Please remember to look for our third video in our series on self-esteem.